General Hospital teaser. While the citizens of Port Charles were swept up in the excitement and festive preparations for the annual Nurses' Ball, a cherished tradition meant to celebrate the unsung heroes of the healthcare community, something far more sinister was brewing just beneath the surface. As colorful banners were hung, rehearsals fine-tuned, and champagne chilled in anticipation of a night of glamour and gratitude, Drew moved in silence, orchestrating a twisted scheme that not even the most cynical residents could have foreseen. With each passing hour, as laughter echoed through the corridors of General Hospital and excitement built in the community, Drew was plotting an act of betrayal so deep, so dark, that it had the power to tear the Ketamine family apart forever. Behind his carefully crafted facade of rehabilitation and redemption, Drew concealed a weapon, not a gun or a knife, but a small, unassuming vial filled with ketamine. It had been acquired discreetly through Brad, a once shady ally whose own hands were not unfamiliar with morally gray dealings. Drew had paid Brad handsomely and without question, the transaction executed in shadows, far from prying eyes. To anyone else, the vial could have passed for just another piece of medical inventory, but in Drew's world, it was the equivalent of a king on a chessboard, ready to topple the queen. He had told Willow it was nothing more than a vitamin supplement, something to help him recover after a recent drugging incident. But that lie, though spoken softly, reeked of deceit. Drew didn't need healing, not in the physical sense. What he craved was power. Absolute, unchallenged power over the Ketamine legacy. And the only thing standing between him and that throne was a formidable matriarch, Tracy. Her unwavering grip on ELQ, her ruthless strategic mind, and her decades of influence made her both an obstacle and a target. And Drew, now devoid of the morals that once defined him, had made a decision: she had to go. Greed had transformed Drew into something unrecognizable. Once a symbol of strength and integrity, someone who had fought for justice and family, he had now evolved into a predator lurking in plain sight. No longer the noble soldier or the steadfast brother, he had become something darker, a man driven by the insatiable hunger to dominate, to possess, to erase anyone who dared to hold even a thread of authority over him. His moral compass, once aligned with truth and honor, had shattered beyond repair. And from those shards emerged a new Drew, colder, smarter, more dangerous. Tracy had unknowingly become the centerpiece of his vendetta. In her, Drew saw the last stronghold of the old Ketamine guard, the final wall that separated him from the complete takeover of ELQ. If she remained in power, Drew would forever be the second son, the shadow behind the legacy. But if she fell, not just in reputation, but in physical health and public trust, the empire would be his for the taking. And so, he waited. He watched as Tracy busied herself with last-minute donations and seating charts for the Nurses' Ball. She had no idea that her own nephew had set his sights on her downfall. The setting was perfect. A ballroom filled with the elite of Port Charles. Journalists. Investors. Socialites. Doctors and nurses. A crowd that would witness not just the performances of the night, but the carefully staged collapse of a legend. Drew didn't just want to destroy Tracy, he wanted to do it publicly, irreversibly, with precision and cruelty. The plan was meticulous. He would slip the ketamine into her drink at the height of the evening, when all attention was on the stage and no one would notice a brief switch of glasses. Once ingested, the powerful sedative would render Tracy incoherent, a public episode of confusion, collapse, and disgrace. He knew that at her age, the drug could have devastating effects. He didn't care. In fact, he counted on it. If she were to die from the incident, even better, the final obstacle eliminated, the throne vacated. But Drew was not just playing for victory. He was playing for vengeance. He blamed Tracy for holding him back, for doubting his capabilities, for constantly reminding him that he wasn't a true Ketamine by blood. He saw her as a relic, a gatekeeper to a legacy he believed was rightfully his. Poisoning her wasn't just about seizing control, it was about sending a message to the entire family. The era of Tracy was over, and the age of Drew had begun. And yet, despite the flawless surface of his plan, Drew had overlooked one crucial element: the unpredictability of human error and the silent resistance of those who still saw glimmers of his former self. Brooke Lynn, ever observant and increasingly wary of Drew's demeanor, had noticed the shift in his behavior. She saw how he lingered near the refreshment table longer than necessary, how his eyes darted around the room like a man with something to hide. She didn't have proof, but her instincts screamed that something was wrong, terribly wrong. What Drew failed to realize was that in his quest to dominate, he had stopped looking over his own shoulder. He believed himself too smart, too powerful, too untouchable. But in the city of Port Charles, where loyalty shifts like tides and secrets refuse to stay buried, even the most cunning predator can become prey. The vial of ketamine sat cold against his chest, tucked inside the lining of his tuxedo jacket. It was more than just a drug. It was a declaration. A threat. A promise. Tonight, Drew intended to do the unthinkable. And he would smile through it all, raise his glass in toast, and watch as the woman who had once ruled with an iron will crumble before a room full of witnesses. But Port Charles has never been a place where darkness remains hidden for long. And as the spotlight prepares to shine on the grandeur of the nurses' ball, it may soon illuminate more than just the glitz and glamour. It may expose a man who sold his soul, and a family on the brink of losing everything. Drew's plan was a masterstroke of calculated malevolence, layered in deception and driven by a seething thirst for domination. Every movement he made, every word he spoke in the days leading up to the nurses' ball had been carefully rehearsed, cloaked beneath the illusion of innocence. He was no longer a man reacting to threats, he was a man orchestrating them. With ruthless precision, he built an intricate web of lies designed to shift the blame of his prior drugging onto Tracy, casting her as the vindictive architect of his supposed downfall. He knew that in a world of high-stakes business and family legacy, reputation was everything. And if he could fracture Tracy's reputation just enough, he wouldn't need to physically eliminate her. The court of public opinion and the ELQ board of directors would do it for him. The narrative he constructed was nothing short of brilliant in its manipulation. He planned to expose Tracy as the one who had hired Jacinda, a mysterious operative whose sudden disappearance had left many unanswered questions, to drug him weeks prior, planting the seed of suspicion so deep that it would bloom into scandal when nurtured at the perfect moment. Drew understood the dynamics of power in the Ketamine family. It wasn't brute strength that unseated titans, it was whispers in the dark, carefully leaked rumors, and public humiliation. With Tracy disgraced, her leadership would be deemed a liability. Her votes in ELQ's boardroom would vanish, her allies would scatter, and her legacy would collapse under the weight of a scandal no one could afford to carry. But Drew didn't want to simply accuse her. He wanted spectacle. He wanted a moment so shocking, so unforgettable, that it would leave an irreversible stain on her legacy. That moment, he decided, would be the nurses' ball, the crown jewel of Port Charles society, a celebration broadcasted across the city, where every major figure in the community would be watching. A stage like that wasn't just for performance, it was for reckoning. As the evening arrived, the ballroom glittered with elegance. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above tables adorned with silk and roses. The air buzzed with anticipation, with guests laughing, toasting, and watching performances that tugged on heartstrings. But in the shadows of that beauty, Drew moved with the calm resolve of a man enacting a prophecy. He had already positioned himself close to Tracy's table. He had timed her patterns, when she would leave to greet a donor, when she would return for her glass of champagne. And in that narrow sliver of absence, Drew seized his moment. He removed the vial of ketamine from his pocket, his movements swift and practiced, honed by weeks of preparation. With the flick of a wrist, he emptied the potent contents into her champagne flute, watching as the liquid dissolved without a trace. It was almost too easy. He returned the glass to its place and stepped back into the crowd, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from the intoxicating thrill of impending victory. But fate, as it often does in Port Charles, had its own script. Somewhere between Drew's calculated maneuver and Tracy's return to her seat, something went wrong. Whether it was a server mistakenly rearranging the drinks, or a well-meaning guest absent-mindedly reaching for the wrong glass, the switch happened unnoticed. And when the music swelled and the spotlight illuminated the stage, a scream shattered the magic of the evening. Gasps echoed through the ballroom as all eyes turned toward the source of the chaos, not Tracy, as Drew had anticipated, but Lois. She collapsed to the ground in a sudden and violent episode, her limbs convulsing as her face contorted in agony. Several guests rushed to her side, among them Brooke Lynn and Olivia, who screamed for help as the color drained from Lois's face. Doctors and nurses sprang into action, turning the once celebratory atmosphere into one of horror and confusion. Drew stood motionless at first, stunned. For a split second, panic pierced through his confidence like a blade. This wasn't part of the plan. Lois was never meant to be involved. But as chaos erupted around him, Drew recovered. His mind, ever calculating, began to pivot. He feigned concern, stepping forward, asking what happened, trying to blend in with the crowd of worried onlookers. No one could suspect him, not yet. But inside, Drew knew the truth. His carefully laid plan had misfired spectacularly. The poison meant for Tracy had nearly killed Lois, a woman completely uninvolved in his vendetta, a woman whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And in that error, Drew saw a different kind of opportunity emerging, one he hadn't anticipated, but might still use. He quickly realized that if Lois didn't survive, the tragedy could serve as a smokescreen. No one would think to trace the source of the ketamine back to him. He could frame the incident as a random poisoning, or better yet, implicate Tracy still, claiming that Lois was never the target but an accidental casualty of Tracy's recklessness. It was cruel, it was opportunistic, but to Drew, it was strategic. The truth didn't matter. Only perception. Meanwhile, paramedics rushed Lois to General Hospital, her fate uncertain, while news of the poisoning spread like wildfire. The media pounced on the story, socialite poisoned at the nurses' ball, headlines screamed. The community buzzed with questions, with theories, with fear. And Drew, always 2 steps ahead, began working the room, planting subtle suggestions in hushed tones. That Tracy had access to powerful medications. That she had motive, after all, hadn't she clashed with Lois over ELQ matters before? And that perhaps this had all been a tragic mistake meant for someone else. But what Drew failed to see, blinded by his ambition, was that not everyone was as easily manipulated as he thought. Brooke Lynn, having witnessed Drew lingering near the table before the poisoning, was now more suspicious than ever. She had seen the flicker of something dark in his eyes recently, and now, with Lois fighting for her life, her instincts screamed that Drew was not innocent. She quietly began to investigate, retrieving surveillance footage, speaking in whispers to those who might have seen something strange that night. She would not let Lois's collapse be swept aside by Drew's lies. As the aftermath of the poisoning settled over Port Charles like a cloud, Drew stood in the center of it all, unshaken on the outside, but aware that his plan had taken a dangerous detour. He had nearly destroyed an innocent woman. He had committed a crime that, if uncovered, would shatter every ounce of power he had sought to gain. But in his mind, the mission remained unchanged. Tracy had to fall. And now, with Lois's tragedy as both a shield and a weapon, he would press forward, more careful, more ruthless, more willing than ever to eliminate anyone who threatened his rise. What Drew didn't know was that the first person to truly stand in his way might be someone he never expected, someone armed with truth, with loyalty, and with a growing understanding of just how monstrous he had become. And as Brooke Lynn followed the trail of deceit back to its origin, the man who had once claimed to protect the Quartermaines would soon find himself at war with the very family he intended to rule. The moment Lois collapsed, an eerie hush fell over the grand ballroom, silencing even the faintest whisper. In a setting that had just moments earlier brimmed with glamour, laughter, and celebration, the atmosphere now turned chillingly somber. Lois, fierce, outspoken, and resilient, the heart of the Cerullo family, lay sprawled on the polished marble floor, motionless. Her eyes, usually alive with fire and conviction, were now shut tight. Her breathing was shallow, faint, barely there. Guests looked on in horror, paralyzed by shock as chaos began to ripple through the opulent crowd. Several rushed toward her, but confusion reigned. No one understood what had just happened, how such a strong woman could fall so suddenly. Within minutes, several doctors and nurses in attendance moved swiftly to her side, assessing her vital signs. One nurse, trembling as she read the data from a portable monitor, confirmed what the professionals already feared. Lois had been poisoned with ketamine, a powerful dissociative anesthetic rarely seen outside surgical wards and illegal operations. The diagnosis was even more dire given her known history of cardiac issues. A substance like ketamine could trigger catastrophic complications in a woman with a vulnerable heart. As emergency responders arrived and began stabilizing her for transport, panic swept across the ballroom like wildfire. Word spread rapidly. Someone had introduced a lethal substance into the most public event in Port Charles. And even more alarming, the whispers began to converge into a terrifying assumption: the real target had been Tracy. What had begun as stunned disbelief morphed into speculation, fear, and suspicion. The memory of Drew's mysterious drugging weeks earlier was still fresh in everyone's minds, unresolved and shrouded in mystery. It seemed too coincidental that the same substance was now used again, and on a night where both Drew and Tracy were in attendance. Drew, however, didn't flinch. With the same calm that had unsettled Brooke Lynn earlier in the evening, he suddenly sprang into action, not with panic or confusion, but with a precise, almost rehearsed sense of control. He rushed to Lois's side, barking orders to call an ambulance, checking her pulse, shouting to clear the space, actions that might have seemed heroic to the unsuspecting. Yet behind the facade of concern was a cold calculation. Drew knew exactly what was happening because he had orchestrated it. When Lois was lifted onto the stretcher and rolled away, her body limp beneath the flashing lights, Drew turned his attention to the crowd. With tear-glazed eyes and a voice steeped in righteous fury, he began pointing fingers, and he pointed them at Tracy. He spun a tale of betrayal and vengeance, laced with fabricated connections and twisted truths. He reminded everyone of his own poisoning, suggesting that Tracy had been the mastermind behind it. And now, in a desperate attempt to protect a long-buried family secret, she had lashed out again, this time, nearly killing an innocent woman. His voice cracked as he lamented the tragedy. His eyes shimmered with what appeared to be sorrow. To the average onlooker, Drew was a man shattered by violence, bravely facing betrayal at the hands of his own blood. But those who looked deeper, those who truly knew Drew, saw something else in his expression, the glint of satisfaction. And it worked. The tide of public opinion began to turn. Whispers of sympathy for Tracy were drowned out by doubt and distrust. Former allies began to distance themselves. Even members of the ELQ board, many of whom had admired Tracy's grit and leadership for decades, now hesitated to defend her. The words reckless, dangerous, and irresponsible hung in the air like a fog, all carefully planted by Drew. He played the victim with impeccable precision, all while manipulating the story to dismantle Tracy's reputation and position. But what Drew failed to anticipate was that someone had been watching him all along.